What is educational research? I'm Samuel Sennett, an assistant professor at Portland State University. What do you think of when you think of educational research? Do you think about numbers? Do you think about questions you have? Do you think about research papers you've read? What is it? Think for a second. One way to look at educational research is to think about finding answers to questions. Very simply, this is the basic goal of any research study. Now, we have other ways of thinking about knowledge, answering questions, but these ways are typically thought of as unreliable or incomplete methods of finding answers. We can look to tradition, authority, different subjects, and common sense. These are all good ways to triangulate knowledge, but with educational research, we're looking for a systematic and objective process. And we believe that that has some superior value for having more certainty to answering our questions. And so we're going to dig into some fundamental concepts of educational research, both in this chapter and section of the course, and then over the whole course, we're going to be getting into these fundamental concepts. And one is to think about how we might define research. We can look at it as systematic inquiry. This is where we're collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and using data. We might be generating new information, maybe for decision making. We might want to understand, describe, or be able to predict or figure out something to control it. For instance, we might want children to read better and more fluently in second grade. Very simply, we can think about it as answering questions. So, why bother with research? Well, we know there are still many problems and questions that exist in the world of educational research. And for these, we want to know the way, we want to show the way. So I work with people who have difficulty speaking, complex communication needs, and we want to know how to help them acquire language. We want to know the way, and then we want to be able to show people that way, dissemination of research. So we also, with educational research, might want to avoid rushed conclusions. So breaking news, look at this image. It's an image of 6 staff members of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network lined up against a wall. The 5 autistic staffers are all wearing purple shirts. So breaking news, purple causes autism. Not so much. Avoiding conclusions, rushed conclusions. So what's research got to do with me? Well, if you look at it as a continuum, you might just have some interest. And having these skills and understandings can help you read studies to learn about practices for your teaching. You can level up your knowledge, your skill. If you have a little more interest, you might want to help out as a research assistant or conduct a literature review of your own. If you have a lot of interest, you could run a study in your classroom as part of some action research. So there's a place for different levels of interest in research. The scientific method. John Dewey, thinking about this procedure for thinking more objectively, we can look, you know the scientific method back from science classes of yesteryear. Clarify main question or main question of the problem. You state that hypothesis, what you think is going to happen, and then collect, analyze, and interpret information related to that question. You can then, through that process of analysis and interpretation, you can then have discussion or conclusions from that, and then you can use that knowledge to verify or reject your original hypothesis. We think about that scientific method, and we compare it or look at an adaptation in educational research. And step 1, specify the topic. Step 2, specify a specific problem on which the research will focus. And then we're going to formulate research questions or hypotheses based on that problem. We're going to run a study, do the methodology, collecting, analyzing, interpreting data, and we're going to state those findings. And oftentimes we're going to be drawing conclusions and sharing what we think in that discussion section related to the original research questions. So we're asking questions, we're going through this process of seeking some definitions and answering results to that question, and we're going to try to draw conclusions about what we found. Educational research. What is it? Educational research is scientific. It begins with a specific question. It requires a research plan, and it requires collecting data, analyzing that data, and then interpreting it. It's typically not linear. It's typically something you have to ask many different times, many different ways to get at knowledge. One study is typically not enough. It's objective, it's curious, inquisitive, and hopefully original. We don't want to be wasting our time with things that we already know. And these questions we ask, this research we conduct, it should be beneficial to someone. It should be meaningful and significant for impacting people's lives. So here you can see in this figure, the same figure in the book, it asks these questions that go deeper into a research line or topic. And so you can see this research question 1 starts with, do students prefer virtual or hands-on dissection in biology class? So we're looking at preference there. Go a little deeper, ask another research question, run another research study. Which technique results in better academic performance? Okay, so first we were looking at preference. Now we're looking at drilling down to, well, what were the results? Which one produced better outcomes for the student grades, student knowledge? Go even deeper, ask, can virtual dissection be used to effectively supplement hands-on dissection? So now we're looking at the combination of the two methods. And then finally, this 4th research question, we've looped around a few times. Is virtual dissection more effective for boys or girls? And is there, or is there no apparent difference? So now we're getting down to a gender difference, and you can see how those questions looped around and covered a fairly broad area around this topic, or inside of this topic. And so in that process of asking and answering questions, we can also look at what educational research is not. And it does not have predetermined outcomes. We're asking real questions. We really are curious and care about this, or these topics, these questions. It's not simply gathering information. We're doing much more than that. It's typically not conclusive, right? These studies have limitations, weaknesses. And last, it's not trivial. This is important stuff that people study. It's important aspects of life. So what are the types of research in education? Well, we often break them up into quantitative, qualitative, and then mixed methods, which is a combination of both of those things. Well, what's quantitative versus qualitative? You can think about quant, that comes from the word number, quantitative, numerical, or collect numerical data. Qualitative, the quality of something. Collect words, pictures, and artifacts. That's a good way to think about qualitative. You can also see those pictures that I've shown you. In the middle, you have the yin and the yang, the mixed methods, a combination of both. So educational research is certainly a process, and different research methods and different research questions require different methodologies, but different techniques, different theories, and different, here it says different views of reality. So when we talk about quantitative, oftentimes quantitative methods require deductive reasoning. And so you can see this funneling effect here in this next figure, where you're starting with a wide variety of observations, other data, and you're analyzing those data and drawing specific conclusions. So you're deducing, and with qualitative methods, we often think about it as inductive reasoning. So starting from this more specific data, limited number of events, experiences, you're going to be grounded theory fits this description, where you're observing things and then deriving or inducing from inducing from that bit of knowledge, from that experience. You're deriving conclusions and generalizations. And you can see that here in this opposite of a funnel, this triangle here. Coming up from the ground, you have these specific observations, other data. You're analyzing it, deriving conclusions and generalizations. So we're going to dip into some terms, and it's important to think about these terms. We're going to talk about variables, hypotheses, research questions, research designs. So this is going to spread out over these chapters, but really over the whole course you're going to be learning about these topics. So let's talk about a few of these research terms now. The participant. This is absolute fundamental. It can also be called the subject. This is the individual whom a researcher studies and the person from whom the researcher collects data. You think about teacher participants, child participants. These are some participants from a study I conducted. And then when you have these participants, you're going to then apply an independent variable. This is the variable on which the researcher exposes and manipulates subjects with different treatments. You can also think about it as the intervention. This is the thing that the researchers do. And so that's the intervention. And we do that intervention, we perform that independent variable, and then we have an outcome. This is the dependent variable. This is what you think may change. And so in my research with this child and educational assistant, we were looking at the child's communication turns per minute. That was the outcome, or the dependent variable. And you can see he had a nice gain. So we're going to be looking at some non-experimental research designs, basic characteristics here. So some examples are descriptive studies, where we're describing an environment, comparative studies, where we're looking at the differences between groups, correlational studies, where we're looking at factors such as risk factors, and correlating different variables together, asking research questions that look at correlation, and then causal comparative studies, where we're looking for these various causal factors. So these aren't experimental because we're not manipulating something. We're just looking at what is, and taking data on what is and analyzing. So when we think about experimental research designs, this also includes quasi-experimental designs. This is where the independent variable is manipulated, and we have typically an experimental group or treatment group, and then we compare it with a control or comparison group. And this concept of manipulation is really fundamental to experimental, right? Experiment, manipulate, so you're doing something. So when we think about these issues, we think about these different terms such as descriptive statistics. These are simply statistics that describe the nature of the data. Inferential statistics, these are statistics where we're making inferences from them, right? You hear that word, inferential. And then we can think about populations versus samples. Population would be the whole group, sample would be a slice or a portion of that group. And then you might have heard this concept of statistical significance. What that means is that the random fluctuating hypothesis that is not a valid threat to validity, that basically we've ruled out that this is just a random occurrence through statistical methods and statistical testing. So, some additional terminology in qualitative research, triangulation or polyangulation is the idea of having multiple sources where you put them together to try to describe a phenomena. And there's various qualitative research designs that you can just start to hear, and phenomenological studies, ethnographic studies, grounded theory research, case studies. We're going to dig into these areas when we get into the qualitative research section of the course. It's going to be really fun. I am a mixed methods researcher myself, and I've been getting more excited about qualitative research and how it can be helpful for certain questions. More about the research process. So when we think about data analysis and qualitative research studies, we can think about different methods. There are tons of different methods. Logical inductive analysis is one way. This grounded theory is another term that you'll hear. When we think about mixed methods research designs, we're thinking about this combination. It can be all different variants where you start with a quantitative study and then go more in depth with a qualitative study, asking in interviews about the phenomena you observed in, say, a quantitative study. Or it can go the other way. You could start with focus groups, interviews, or a case study about a topic or occurrence, and then out of that derive a more experimental study or series of experimental studies that are quantitative. And so we're going to be talking about some of the benefits of using various research methods and then looking at different combinations. We're also going to delve into action research. This is where oftentimes it's mixed methods, but it could be one or the other. And this is where you're working in your own environment, doing research in your own teaching. Okay, so let's take and talk about some examples. I'm going to be showing you a number of examples, but I'm just going to show you a couple examples here. Single case design. This is an example of experimental quantitative research. Oftentimes it's not fully experimental because you don't have randomization, it's small n. Here's studying my dissertation, empowering children with complex communication needs to use iPad-based AAC during shared storybook reading. Okay, the individual serves as their own control, baseline period, you introduce the independent variable, you're looking for a certain outcome, measuring repeatedly, and then replicating that across participants, sometimes across environments or communication partners. So that's an example of single subject design, quantitative. And so with any type of research, you need to know about your specific discipline. And you can read up on this and read research reports, something that's got a good degree of rigor because other researchers have read and vetted these papers. And you can learn a lot from this process of diving in, and you can learn about this value of conducting your own research, of being a critical consumer, being able to look at research and harness this knowledge can help you write grant proposals, win money for your school, or if you're a researcher to do more research. You can do a thesis or a dissertation, and you can conduct small-scale studies in your own classroom to meet your own curiosity and your needs to understand. And it can be so empowering to have data. It's just amazing. So think about this as a bit of an introduction. We've talked about a few terms, and we're going to delve deeper each week and ask lots of questions and keep it simple. You're not going to be an absolute expert in any of these topics yet, but you may pick out one that you want to be more expert in.